There is no sin but ignorance. Magnus the Red. Magnus, the Crimson King of Prospero, the Cyclops, was intended to be the Emperor's sorcerer and is possibly Warhammer 40k's greatest tragedy. And the community is torn in half, divided into the factions who believe Magnus did nothing wrong, and it's all Magnus's fault. In this series, we've been diving deep into the Primarch's natures and accomplishments, so strap into your robot pants for this one, because Magnus the Red may just be the most complex, tragic, and insane Primarch in the setting. For it is true that out of all the demigod sons of the Emperor, the master of mankind, it was Magnus who was to be his true heir, destined to sit the golden throne. And of all the Primarchs who turned traitor, it was perhaps Magnus who fell the hardest. Now I have no doubt that were circumstances slightly different, that if the skeins of fate were woven and cut just a bit differently, that Magnus would not only have remained loyal to his father, the Emperor of mankind, but he would have been perhaps the greatest champion on the side of the loyalists, with only the exception of the Emperor himself. And I believe this would have turned the tide of the war and probably saved the Emperor from what must have been an awful case of hemorrhoids at this point, after sitting for 10,000 years straight. That would put a strain on anyone, even the corpse of a god. So why is this one Primarch both revered and hated so much in the Warhammer 40k community? Well, to be honest, my opinion on this is that when you read his story and you see it from his point of view, you realize that Magnus is undoubtedly right in most of the things he does, or at least righteous and good in the reasoning behind everything he did. And the same is true when you read from the other perspectives, that he was wrong, insolent, recalcitrant, and insubordinate. So either way, you can believe what you want about the character and be right. Perhaps even more so than even Horus Lupercal. To say Magnus is complex is a massive understatement. Magnus is very much like the patron that he would come to serve, tzeentch. Overly complicated and analytical, and with his semi-prescient abilities, he can come across as larger than life. Magnus was unique among the Primarchs, who were, as a whole, the most unique beings in the galaxy. He was able to remember his childhood, even his infancy and conception, and was telepathically communicating with the Emperor even before the Primarchs were scattered through the warp. He had exceptional abilities, and was undoubtedly the smartest of all of his brothers, intellectually. But as we'll see, brains are often inconsequential when common sense is required, and in that regard, Magnus was quite lacking. So, the world the infant Primarch was cast to was very, very far from Terra. Prospero, or Prospero, however you want to say it, was in fact the perfect place for a being such as Magnus to end up. It was a planet where sorcery and psychic abilities were highly regarded and openly studied, and they were used to warp shenanigans and weirdness, so to these scholarly occult types, the infant giant with bright red skin with extreme psychic abilities coming down from the heavens to dwell with them just seemed natural, and struck no one as out of the ordinary. It's just the sort of thing that happens there. So Magnus grew up learning magic and sorcery and surpassed all of his teachers in everything. Eventually, he was called into action to deal with a menace that had plagued Prospero for centuries and was going to possibly cause the downfall of civilization on the planet. The Psychnoian, which were insectoid, wasp-like beings whose females would psychically inject their eggs into the brains of hosts. They were the size of a grain of sand, and when they hatched, after one day, they would begin to consume their host's brain. The population had to learn to control their psychic abilities more and keep them in check in order not to attract these monstrosities, but it took Magnus to quell them to the point of being a non-issue, and he became the hero of Prospero. Then, his father showed up. And why wouldn't he? With Magnus's huge brain and his super psychic abilities, the Emperor could sense his presence in the warp and came right for him. When he eventually landed on Prospero, he and Magnus embraced and picked up as if they had a lifelong relationship going already, which they did, unbeknownst to everyone around Magnus, because of that psychic connection and telepathic communication. The Emperor had never truly lost contact with his 15th son. Only in body were they separated. But now, reconnected with his father, Magnus's fate would unravel in the most mysterious of ways, and his own personal doom would be intrinsically tied to the doom of the Imperium of man, the ruination of all the Emperor had fought to establish during the Great Crusade, and his father's internment upon the Golden Throne of Terra. The legion that Magnus inherited, those Astartes developed from his gene seed, were not quite up to standards. They were overwhelmed, as a legion, by rampant mutation. Magnus's gene seed was too much for them, in my opinion, and the Emperor and Magnus sought ways to fix this. They went scrying into the Imperium, looking for knowledge that could help, and eventually Magnus was helped by a being he was unaware at the time happened to be tzeentch. For the price of his eye, the Crimson King's legion's mutations were halted, a brief reprieve. But what Magnus didn't realize was that he had just bargained with the devil. He had sold his soul, not just his eye, to the ruinous powers. And at this time, nobody was aware of the existence of such beings. No human, that is, save the Emperor and Malcador, perhaps Constantine Valdor, but it was not known yet to the Primarchs. Something many criticized the Emperor for. For with a little forewarning and a bit of a heads up, everything Magnus wrought upon the galaxy could have been avoided. So the Sorcerer Lord of Prospero had invited Dracula into his house, but he didn't know it yet. So, as Magnus is going about his business, leading his legion, the Thousand Sons, he gets to know some of his brother Primarchs, and actually, even though he's a total nerdy bookworm, makes friends with Horus Lupercal, Jagatai Khan, and Lorgar Aurelian. As the Great Crusade goes on, these were his only real peers and friends among his brothers. But as he and his legion are prosecuting the Emperor's Great Crusade across the galaxy, they kept coming across worlds where sorcery was the way of that culture. Little did he know it was chaos cults he kept running into. But along the way, he gathered all of this arcane lore and knowledge of the warp and its denizens into a tome that would become known as the Book of Magnus, the most comprehensive occult tome compiled by man. As the crusade waged on, the Primarchs kept coming across horrific, monstrous entities using warp sorcery, and it got worse the further from Terra they went. And this made Magnus look pretty bad, cast him in a similar light as the horrors the Imperium was fighting, as the terrible horrors of the warp were even employing similar powers to Magnus and his Thousand Sons Legion. It made many of his brother Primarchs suspicious, and eventually it came to a head as the Emperor called for an investigation into the use of sorcery. And it did not go well. In fact, I'm going to preface explaining it by saying the Emperor did not act in a way suiting his majesty, and did something beneath his level of dignity. I believe he acted in a petty way, but that's just my opinion. Okay, so, after Leman Russ and Magnus almost killed each other over the use of sorcerous powers, the Emperor's debate forum on the use of psychic powers, more than anything else probably, sealed the fate of the galaxy. It let chaos in a big way, setting up a foundation with the Imperium's leadership that, to me, rivals even the machinations of Erebus and Corferon of the Word-Bearers. Russ pleaded to ban psychic powers, because Space Marines should be using brute strength and force. The Space Wolves claimed their own psychers were channeling the power of their homeworld, Fenris, rather than that of the warp, so the rune priests weren't committing the sin of sorcery. And Mortarion of the Death Guard narked his brother Magnus out for the use of what Mortarion saw as heretical sorcery. Ironic, as eventually Mortarion would become a demon Primarch and quite a powerful sorcerer himself. Magnus pled that all knowledge was good, and it was how you used it that could make it bad. He argued strongly for the use of psychic powers, but what had been intended to be a free and open debate ultimately proved to be more or less just the trial of Magnus the Red, and he pled his case in front of tens of thousands of people. Ultimately, the Emperor, rather than warning his sons that the warp they were playing in was toxic waste, completely forbade the Primarchs and the Space Marine legions from using any sorcery at all. And this was crushing for Magnus and the Thousand Sons. He was literally told his whole thing, his entire identity, the sorcery he'd dedicated his life to, was now illegal. The librarians of the legions were disbanded, and the librarians were sent to the ranks like all the regular soldiers and forbidden from using their strongest gifts. Magnus swore in front of everyone that he would obey his father's edict, but he totally had his fingers crossed. And of course, he and his legion continued to use sorcery in secret, which, can you blame him? I mean, he was literally the Emperor's sorcerer. But the Emperor had more sons than just the sorcerer, and among them was the executioner, Leman Russ, the Wolf King. And in what many think of as the ultimate defining moment of Magnus the Red, the two ended up pitted against one another. So, Magnus used sorcery to scry into the warp, and he saw visions of the future, for all the legions and their Primarchs except his own. Magnus saw Horus's betrayal and how it would play out for everyone, except the Thousand Sons and himself. And he tried to warn the War Master Horus not to betray their father, but it didn't work, and he did not have time to relay the message to his father via the typical astropathic channels, so Magnus decided to use the sorcery he was literally just forbidden from using to contact his father, and sought to project his message through the webway straight to Terra and the Emperor. There was a massive warp storm causing interference, so he had no other choice. He didn't know that the webway portion he found was one created by the Emperor for use by humanity, nor was he aware of the enormous psychic might it was requiring of the Emperor to allow the webway workers to remain safe, as the Emperor was simply holding the door closed on waves upon waves of innumerable demons. But Magnus's message was so important he risked everything to contact his father. So he basically blew a giant hole in the webway project and ruined everything. The webway gate beneath the Golden Throne was literally threatened. Demons flooded the human-built sections of the webway, slaughtering the mechanicum workers toiling endlessly on the project. In an instant, Magnus had ruined everything that the Emperor of Mankind had worked for literally tens of thousands of years. He destroyed it. And the Emperor was furious. Not only did he disbelieve that Horus could be a traitor, yeah, he was in total denial, but he believed that Magnus was lying and probably had turned to chaos himself. Biggie wasn't wrong about that, but Magnus did not yet know it. This would become known as Magnus's folly. So the Emperor hung up the phone on Magnus and sent Leman to go fetch him, bring him back to Terra so he could get a spanking. But Horus, the ever-devious one, had not revealed himself to Leman Russ, and as Russ was going through the galaxy on his way to Prospero to get Magnus, Horus gave Russ new orders. He said that the Emperor had changed his mind and wanted Magnus dead and the Thousand Sons destroyed entirely. Russ, believing Horus was still loyal and still his war master and commanding officer, obeyed. And thus the burning of Prospero ensued. The Space Wolves massacred that world. They burned the libraries of occult knowledge that had taken Magnus centuries to accumulate, and Russ and Magnus engaged in single combat. It did not go well for them either. Either of them. Russ got one of his hearts literally punched out by Magnus, who, despite being the most well-read, smartest, and nerdiest of the Primarchs, was also among the physically strongest. Also, he could change size at will. When they engaged in combat, Magnus thought that he was going to die that day. He had foreseen that his captain Azik Ahriman would survive, and so entrusted him with securing the Book of Magnus. But Magnus could not see his own fate and believed that he was going to face Russ to die. And when they closed with one another, Magnus put up a veil of lightning energy around them so that none could disturb their conflict. And then he unleashed on Russ the same power, but it did nothing. Russ seemed oblivious to it. And he closed with Magnus, delivering a blow that cracked the Crimson King's breastplate. Magnus was shook and unleashed balefire that consumed Russ and lit his hair on fire, smashing a hole in Russ's armor in return. It went on back and forth, and to those outside the lightning field, the two seemed to grow like giants as the frost blade met the golden axe again and again. The battle between the Primarchs and also their legions was extremely epic, but that is the subject for another video unless you want this one to be 2 hours long. Essentially, Russ ended up getting horrifically, near fatally injured, but ended up also blinding Magnus's remaining eye and messing him up bad. He snapped Magnus's arm like a twig, something I've done to myself skateboarding, so I know that had to hurt. Yep, 12 screws and 2 plates in my arm. Then Russ eventually held the Crimson King up and did a pro wrestling style backbreaker over his knee and shattered Magnus. As he was set to deliver the killing blow, Magnus uttered a word that enacted a spell that sent himself and his entire legion into the warp. All Russ was left with was Magnus's words on the wind as the skies rained tears of oil for the Lord of Prospero. "You were a sword in the wrong hands, my brother. You have severed an innocent neck, and it will plague you forever." So after losing on Prospero and going into the warp and accepting tzeentch into his heart, as his personal lord and savior, Magnus no longer existed physically, but was now incorporeal, and a being of psychic might within the warp. Magnus was now ascended, but I have heard it said by more than one GW writer that all the traitor Primarchs who went Demon Prince in the end are technically dead. And yeah, Magnus might not have a consistent body any longer, but he may just be a spirit. But he's the strongest spirit ever and can manifest physically however he wants in an ever-shifting form. Oh, but wait. The side effects. Yes, he might just be a soul now, but he's a soul that was shattered. He is now many shards, and the shards are not all together. And some represent parts of himself he desperately needs, such as his honor, love, compassion, and humanity. But those shards, particularly the one that we're about to talk about, are out of his reach forever. So now that Magnus serves tzeentch, and had, from his perspective, had the Space Wolves try to kill him and his legion, he joined the traitor cause and sided with Horus Lupercal in the attempt to overthrow the Emperor of Mankind. So, Magnus and the Thousand Sons were at the Siege of Terra, and Magnus gave Mortarion some advice on using his warp nature to control the constant pain he was in. This was really just a manipulation tactic that got the Death Guard to commit. Magnus was already acting as an agent of tzeentch, even manipulating his allies. But he sneaks into the Imperial Palace and wants to slay the Emperor, who is stuck dealing with the Webway mess. While infiltrating the palace, he actually saves a group of refugees from Phosphex, which is basically a war crime. Anyway, he comes upon Malcador after entering the Hall of Lang, shout out to Lovecraft there, and he comes upon Malcador and Olivia Surica. Malcador is like, hey, play chess with her, but was trying to get Magnus onto his side. Eventually, Malcador reveals that the shard of Magnus that is his most noble part, his humanity and loyalty, are now permanently out of his reach, as Malcador used it to create the first of the Grey Knights. But Magnus, in his fury, slew Malcador, as even though it was thought that Malcador was second in power psychically to the Emperor, Magnus was far stronger. But even though Malcador was a perpetual and his death wasn't permanent, it still shook Magnus pretty hard. He didn't like having to do that. The funny thing is, no matter how hard you try, any person would be hard-pressed to paint Magnus as actually evil. Sure, he's a chaos-serving disciple of tzeentch, but his heart is actually, well, usually, in the right place. Now, the son came before the father as Magnus enters the throne room. On their way, Magnus and his crew who snuck in with him met an apparition of the Emperor, like a projection, called Revelation. And Revelation leads them to the throne room unimpeded, right before the Emperor on the golden throne. Magnus dispels the projection of Revelation and goes to strike his father down, only to be blocked by Vulcan, before another epic Primarch battle ensued. And yes, it got pretty thick with Thousand Sons fighting salamanders. Big E opens his eyes and transports Magnus to a pocket dimension, floating through the Webway or somewhere like that, and he shows Magnus the future where no Primarch had turned. How the Webway project would have turned out and united the Imperium without the need for the warp or sorcery to travel, and how Magnus himself sat upon the golden throne, guarding the Webway gate while his soul projected through the cosmos, experiencing true bliss while he and his father learned the secrets of the universe together. And Magnus was allowed back into his father's good graces. The Emperor knew he messed up and that it wasn't Magnus's fault. But the catch was that Big E saw the Thousand Sons as too corrupted and would not be allowed back into the fold. So, they would need to be put down, and Magnus would be given a new, unmutated legion. And Magnus refused, outright rejected his father's offer. He would not betray his sons. The way his father had betrayed him, he said, "No way, not at all, sir," and was cast back into real space in the battle with Vulcan. Eventually he was going to lose, bad, and be destroyed. So Magnus fully let tzeentch in at that point and accepted the full blessings of the Lord of Change and the Weaver of Fates and ascended to demonhood. And in doing so was immediately expelled from the Imperial Palace by the wards in place that kept demons out, ultimately saving him from Vulcan's wrath. And the fact that he did not betray his sons is literally the most defining characteristic of Magnus the Red to me. It isn't what he did or didn't do wrong. It is how he didn't punch down. And he was the best father in the galaxy. Absolutely a stand-up guy in nearly every way. And of all the traitor Primarchs, I personally don't blame him at all for anything he did. I actually feel sorry for him and all that he was forced to do. This video ran a little long already, so I'm going to get into Magnus's actions in the current timeline in a sequel to this video.